Daniel the Beloved by William M. Taylor. Chapter 5. Pride Abased. Daniel, Chapter 4. The fourth chapter of the book of Daniel consists of a decree published by Nebuchadnezzar after he had passed through a series of most remarkable experiences, and we may, perhaps, have the clearest idea of its meaning and design if we weave into a consecutive narrative the different incidents to which it refers. After this Babylonian monarch had finished his military career by conquering all his enemies, he set himself to improve his territory and beautify his capital with all the resources which he had accumulated. Whatever wealth could procure, or skill devise, or labor accomplish, was obtained by him for his country and his metropolis, until, at length, Babylon was ranked among the wonders of the world. Much had been done for that ancient city by Ninus and Semiramis, and even before the days of Nebuchadnezzar it was numbered among the grandest places on the surface of the earth. Yet what the Rome of Augustus was to the Rome of the Republic, or what Paris under the last Napoleon was to Paris in the days of the First Revolution, that, only perhaps on a larger and more gorgeous scale, was Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar to Babylon as it existed before his days. That we may see the truth of this statement, let us take a description of the city in its greatest splendor, and then mark how much of it is traced by ancient writers to the monarch of whom we speak. The city stood on the river Euphrates, by which it is divided into two parts, eastern and western, and these were connected by a bridge of wonderful construction. Quote, the wall was at least 60 miles in circumference, and would, of course, include an area 3 times as large as that covered by London and its appendages. It was laid out in 625 squares, formed by the intersection of 25 streets at right angles. The walls, which were of brick, were at least 75 feet high and 32 broad. A trench surrounded the city, the sides of which were lined with brick and waterproof cement. End quote. Now, the eastern, or older part of the city, Nebuchadnezzar repaired and beautified throughout. The western portion he added entirely himself, and the bridge which connected the two was of his construction. Besides these, he surrounded the entire city with several new lines of fortification, and constructed a new palace adjoining the old residence of his father. In the grounds of his palace he erected those hanging gardens which were the marvel of the ancient world. His wife, having been brought up in Media, desired something to remind her of her native land, and for her satisfaction he constructed a raised terrace, on the summit of which were flowers and pleasure grounds of the most beautiful description. This terrace is described as having been a square 400 feet each way, and raised to an elevation of 75 feet above the ground. It was approached by sloping walks, and supported by a series of arched galleries increasing in height from the base to the summit. In these galleries were various chambers, one of which contained the engines by which water was raised from the river to the surface of the mound. Nor are we dependent on the testimony of ancient historians alone for these particulars. The standard inscription, referred to in my last discourse, relates at length the construction of the whole series of works, and appears to have been the authority from which Berossus drew. While the ruins of Babylon, at this date, covering as they do an area of 200 square miles, confirm this in the most decisive manner, for 9/10 of the bricks found there are stamped with Nebuchadnezzar's name. But his buildings were not confined to the city of Babylon. Quote, I have examined, end quote, says Sir Henry Rawlinson, quote, the bricks in situ belonging, perhaps, to 100 different towns and cities in the neighborhood of Baghdad, and I never found any other legend than that of Nebuchadnezzar, son of Nabopolassar, king of Babylon. End quote. Hence we may believe that throughout his empire he built or rebuilt cities, repaired temples, constructed quays, reservoirs, canals, and aqueducts on a scale of grandeur and magnificence surpassing everything of the kind recorded in history, unless it be the public works of one or two of the greatest Egyptian monarchs. There is also reason to conclude that an extensive system of irrigation was devised by him, and that the Babylonians were indebted to him for the vast network of canals which covered the whole alluvial tract between the two rivers, Tigris and Euphrates, and extended on the right bank of the Euphrates to the extreme verge of the stony desert. After all this building activity, and with a large amount of self-satisfaction at the completion of so many of his plans, the king was at rest in his palace, when a dream came to him in the visions of the night, which made him sore afraid. As on the former occasion, he sent for the Chaldeans, and asked them to interpret it after he had told them what it was. For this time the thing had so deeply burned itself upon his brain that he had not been able to forget it, and did not, therefore, need that it should be reproduced. The vision was on this wise. He saw in the midst of the earth a tree, which grew so great that its height reached unto the heavens, and it was a conspicuous object even to the uttermost bound of the horizon. Its leaves were fair, and its fruit abundant. It gave shelter to the beasts of the field, which gathered underneath its spreading boughs, and to the fowls of the air, which built their nests in its leafy branches, and it afforded food to all who dwelt in its vicinity. At length, however, an angelic being made his appearance, and gave commandment that it should be hewn down, yet not so that it should be entirely destroyed, for its root was to be left in the earth. But at this stage of his injunction, the angel's language ceases to be applicable to a tree, and becomes such as could be fulfilled only in the case of a man. Quote, "Let his heart be changed from a man's, and let a beast's heart be given unto him, and let 7 times pass over him. This matter is by the decree of the watchers, and the demand by the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living may know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will, and setteth up over it the basest of men." End quote. There is in all this much of that incongruity which is characteristic of dreams. Yet the turn of the angel's words, whereby he indicated that the tree represented a man, and the moral purpose of the whole, as expressed in his concluding phrases, could not but impress the heart of Nebuchadnezzar. And even before he had received the interpretation from Daniel, his conscience must have whispered that the tree was designed to represent himself. Just as, at a later day, the trembling of Belshazzar, when he saw the handwriting on the wall, was itself an interpretation, or rather, the consequence of an interpretation, already made by himself of the mysterious characters, so the anxiety of Nebuchadnezzar here was the result of an application to himself of this singular vision. But his conscience gave him only a vague presentiment of its real meaning. So, wishing to discover the particular significance of each part of his dream, and regarding it as a revelation from heaven, he sent for the Chaldeans to give him the explanation. One wonders that, after his former experience, he did not send for Daniel at once. But many years had elapsed since the date of the interpretation of the former dream, and the vivid impression made upon his mind at that time of the preeminence of Daniel's God had been effaced. So he resorted to the accredited source of light in his empire. But the Chaldeans were again at fault. They could not explain this dream any more than they could reproduce the former. At the last, however, Daniel, apparently without having been sent for, presented himself to the monarch, and after having heard the dream, he was so grieved at its meaning that he sat speechless for an hour, and only regained the power of utterance to say with the sincerest emotion, quote, "My Lord, the dream be to them that hate thee, and the interpretation thereof to thine enemies." End quote. He then, after recapitulating the various objects in the vision, gave the interpretation thus, quote, "They shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and they shall wet thee with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over thee, till thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will." End quote. Then, passing from the interpreter to the counselor, the faithful prophet, valuing the welfare of the monarch more than his good opinion for the moment, and fearing degradation for him more than the loss of favour for himself, added these words, which are not more remarkable for the courtesy of their tone than for the sternness of their fidelity. Quote, "Wherefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable unto thee, and break off thy sins by righteousness, and thine iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, if it may be a lengthening of thy tranquillity." End quote. We do not know how this wise advice was received. Perhaps the monarch was too thankful to obtain an explanation of his dream to quarrel with the moral precepts of him who had interpreted it, and so, while inwardly chafing at the rebuke which was implied in Daniel's words, he may have smothered his indignation for the time, and allowed his servant to go as unreproved as he was unrewarded. But however he felt at the moment, we know that no improvement characterized either his disposition or his conduct. For a full year things went on as before, and perhaps the king may have been congratulating himself that for once Daniel was wrong in his interpretation, or that the dream had no special significance. But though God's retribution may come slowly, it comes surely, and ere long all that Daniel had described was realized. Looking forth from his palace over the city which he had done so much to beautify, extend, and fortify, he was in the very act of giving utterance to the pride with which his heart was swelling, when a great calamity came upon him. Scarcely had he said, quote, "Is not this great Babylon, that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power, and for the honour of my majesty," end quote, when a voice from heaven fell upon his ear repeating Daniel's prophecy. In the terror produced by this divine communication, his reason was dethroned, and he went forth a wretched maniac, leaving his kingdom to be cared for by his son, and living for 7 times, that is, as something for 7 years, after the manner of the beasts of the field. Much has been written by commentators in all ages on this illness of Nebuchadnezzar, but it is generally agreed, from the use of these words in reference to his recovery, quote, "Mine understanding returned unto me," end quote, that he became insane, and from the description of the condition to which he was reduced, physiologists have concluded that he was afflicted with that species of madness in which, quote, "the sufferer, while retaining his consciousness in other respects, imagines himself to be changed into some animal, and acts up to a certain point in conformity with that persuasion. Those who imagined themselves changed into wolves howled like wolves, and, falsely, as there is reason to believe, accused themselves of bloodshed. Others imitated the cries of dogs." End quote. The disease goes by the generic name of zoanthropia. In the case before us, Nebuchadnezzar fancied himself an ox, and acted in conformity with that imagination, eating grass among the cattle, and remaining exposed in the fields to all weathers, until his hair became like the feathers of an eagle in length and matted consistency, and his nails like the claws of a bird. All this while, however, there must have been within him somewhat of a consciousness of his real identity, which must, one would think, have intensified to him the misery of his malady. Dr. Pusey, in his, quote, "Lectures on Daniel," end quote, quotes the following sentences on this point from Dr. Brown, the Commissioner of the Board of Lunacy for Scotland, who speaks from an experience of 30 years. Quote, "My opinion is," end quote, says he, quote, "that of all mental powers or conditions, the idea of personal identity is but rarely enfeebled, and that it is never extinguished. The ego, self, and non-ego, not self, may be confused. The ego, however, continues to preserve the personality. All the angels, devils, dukes, lords, kings, gods, many that I have had under my care, remained what they were before they became angels, dukes, etc., in a sense, and even nominally. I have seen a man declaring himself the Saviour, or St. Paul, yet sign his own name James Thompson, and attend worship as regularly as if the notion of divinity had never entered into his head. I think it probable, therefore, because consistent with experience in similar forms of mental affection, that Nebuchadnezzar retained a perfect consciousness that he was Nebuchadnezzar during the whole course of his degradation." End quote. Some have supposed that the band of iron and brass which was to be put round the stump of the tree symbolized the mode of restraint to which the maniac monarch was subjected, inasmuch as he was probably bound in chains, either to keep him from inflicting injury upon himself, or to prevent him from doing harm to others. But whether he was bound thus, or whether he was permitted to wander at his will among the cattle of the fields, we must equally see how much cause for gratitude we in these days have in the fact that, owing to the advance of medical science, insanity is recognized as a disease, just as much and as really as a fever is, and that those who are afflicted with it are in the main treated with gentleness, and in such a way as shall best conduce to the restoration of health to the brain. It is always a terrible affliction. It is indeed, in my view, the most painful form of disease to which our complex humanity is liable. And when one sees a man endowed with such strength of mind as Nebuchadnezzar possessed, yet reduced to such a pitiable condition, one is led to thank God as he never did before for the continuance of his reason, and to pray that he may be preserved from similar distress. For if Dr. Brown's idea that the king kept all through the consciousness that he was Nebuchadnezzar be correct, his agony must at times have been most acute, and if this were the time or place, or if it were needed to bring out more forcibly the point on which I am now insisting, we might quote from the recorded experience of others in similar circumstances, how bitterly they felt the humiliation of their condition. What an anguish it was now and then to Robert Hall, with the noble intellect of his, to awake to the fact, as he sometimes did after a paroxysm of madness, that he had become so irrational. And similar shocks of agony must have gone through the heart of Nebuchadnezzar during his time of affliction. But after the 7 times had gone, the king lifted up his eyes unto heaven, and his understanding came to him again, but came in a form more clear than before, for now he perceived that his greatness was not all his own. He discovered that he had nothing which he had not received, and he was disposed to give to the Most High God the glory of all that he was, and all that he had done. With this recognition of the King eternal, immortal, and invisible, the only wise God, his reason came to him, and the glory of his kingdom and the honour and the brightness of his court were restored, and his, quote, counsellors and his lords sought again to him, and he was established in his kingdom. End quote. It has been thought a strange thing that no record of this mental eclipse of Nebuchadnezzar should be found in the ancient historians of his times. But the silence of these authors may, perhaps, be thus accounted for. Berosus, being himself a native of Babylon, and having what one may call a pardonable pride in the greatness of Nebuchadnezzar, the most illustrious monarch of the empire, may have been tempted to suppress this incident, lest it should seem to mar the splendour of his renown. And as for Herodotus, he did not visit Babylon till 100 years after the death of Nebuchadnezzar, and it may well be doubted if he ever heard anything about that monarch's madness. But recently, a portion of the great standard inscription among the cuneiform memorials of the empire has been brought to light by Rawlinson, which, to say the least of it, seems to contain an allusion to the singular hiatus in his reign which his lunacy produced. I quote the passage as it is given in Smith's, quote, Dictionary of the Bible, end quote. Quote, after describing the construction of the most important of his great works, he appears to say, for 4 years the seat of my kingdom did not rejoice my heart. In all my dominions I did not build a high place of power. The precious treasures of my kingdom I did not lay up. In Babylon, buildings for myself and for the honour of my kingdom I did not lay out. In the worship of Merodach, my lord, the joy of my heart, in Babylon, the seat of his sovereignty, and the seat of my empire, I did not sing his praises. I did not furnish his altars with victims, nor did I clear out the canals. Other negative clauses follow. It is plain that we have here narrated a suspension, apparently for 4 years, of all those works and occupations on which the king especially prided himself, his temples, palaces, worship, offerings, and works of irrigation. And though the cause of the suspension is not stated, we can scarcely imagine anything that would account for it but some extraordinary malady as that recorded in Daniel. End quote. To say the least of it, we have here a very singular coincidence, and we may fairly enough adduce this strange passage from the standard inscription as counterbalancing the silence of the ancient historians upon the subject. But now the question presents itself. What did Nebuchadnezzar design by the publication of the decree in which these facts are here preserved? Did he mean to represent himself as having become an adherent of the Jewish faith? Did he put this forth as an account of what we, in modern phrase, would call his, quote, conversion, end quote? Was he, after the publication of this decree, or rather, after the occurrences on which it is founded, a truly regenerate man? A real and devout believer in Jehovah as the only living and true God? These questions are much more easily asked than answered. On the one hand, There is much in the document which looks as if the king had become a believer in the unity and supremacy of Jehovah, as when he speaks of him as the Most High, of his dominion as everlasting, and of his authority as absolute. On the other hand, there are detached expressions which seem to indicate that he was still a worshipper of the inferior deities of polytheism. Thus, he names Daniel, quote, Belteshazzar, end quote, adding the clause, quote, according to the name of my God, end quote, and says of him, quote, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods, end quote. It would appear, therefore, that while acknowledging the supremacy of Jehovah as the Most High, he still clung to the worship and service of inferior divinities. Hence, though there was what might be called a conversion in him, it was still an imperfect conversion. He did not allow his belief in a supreme God to interfere with the acknowledgement of inferior gods. Just as Cyrus, in his edict, owned the supremacy of the God of Israel, and Artaxerxes spoke of him as the God of heaven, while neither of them, so far as we know, abjured the polytheism in which they had both been educated, so it is not improbable that Nebuchadnezzar was brought, by the influence of his affliction, to recognize the supreme power of Jehovah, while yet he retained his worship of other deities. This reading of his character, too, is most in harmony with his intense devotion to the idol Bel-Merodach, which, as we saw in our former lecture, comes out in the great cuneiform inscription, to which I have so frequently alluded. But it must also be admitted that there is much in the document before us to incline us to believe that he became a really renewed man. Hence we find the commentator Scott saying, with his usual caution, quote, the beginning and conclusion of this chapter lead us at least to hope with prevailing confidence that he was at last made a monument of the power of divine grace and the exceeding riches of divine mercy, end quote. And Matthew Henry thus similarly concludes his interesting comment on this chapter, quote, whether he continued in the same good mind that here he seems to have been in, we are not told, nor doth anything appear to the contrary, but that he did. And if so great a blasphemer and persecutor did find mercy, he was not the last. And if our charity reached so far as to hope that he did, we must admire free grace, by which he lost his wits for a while, that he might save his soul forever. End quote. I undertake not to decide where so much uncertainty is felt by every candid reader. Long since the king has gone to his account, and we may be sure that the judge of all the earth will do right regarding him. Hence, without dwelling further on a point which we cannot settle, let us see what lessons we may glean for ourselves from this deeply interesting record. And, first, we have here a solemn and instructive warning against pride and vainglory. With all his ability, Nebuchadnezzar had nothing which he had not received from God. His intellectual greatness, his military success, his architectural triumphs, all were gifts to him from Jehovah. And if he had humbly and cheerfully acknowledged this, and given God the glory, he would have been yet greater in his piety and humility than he was in all his other excellencies put together. What a difference between him and Daniel in this respect! When the young captive had reproduced and interpreted the vision of the composite image, and was afterward complimented for it by the king, he was careful first to say, quote, as for me, this secret is not revealed to me for any wisdom that I have more than any living, but for their sakes that shall make known the interpretation to the king, and that thou mightest know the thoughts of thy heart. End quote. How much more attractive is the example of the prophet than that of the monarch? In which of them, brethren, do we see ourselves? For let us not imagine that such pride as Nebuchadnezzar evinced is manifested by kings and earthly grandees alone. It may be as really existent in the heart of someone here tonight as it was in that of the Babylonian emperor. Whoever plumes himself upon what he has done in the world, as if he were the author of it all, and not simply the instrument in the hand of God, is as really and truly proud and haughty as was Nebuchadnezzar here. The merchant, who speaks of his business as the sole result of his ability, and calls himself, with supreme satisfaction, quote, the architect of his own fortunes, end quote, the author, who thinks of his book as the creation of his own genius, the statesman, who looks upon his position as entirely self-made, the artisan, who prides himself upon his foremanship, and the millionaire, who, looking upon his glittering heaps, congratulates himself as the sole author of his gains, all alike are guilty of Nebuchadnezzar's sin. For they have shut God out of their hearts, and they have not given him the acknowledgment and the honour to which he is entitled. Let us seek, therefore, each to be clothed with humility, and, wherever we are and whatever we have, let us acknowledge God. Quote, every good gift and every perfect gift cometh down, from him, and to him we should give all the honour. In heaven they cast their crowns before the throne, implying that only by the favour of him who sits thereon have they crowns at all, and it should be the same on earth. The prizes we win in the race of life should be won by us that we may put them into Jehovah's hand. This would sanctify the race itself, and this would take away the danger of success. The full cup is difficult to carry. Let us therefore pour it out before the Lord. The lofty height makes one dizzy as he looks down and begins to think that he has by his own power toiled up the steep. But when, looking up, he sees how far he is still beneath God, and cries for the continuance of his holding and helping hand, he is steadied again and renews his ascent. Let us, therefore, guard against pride, and learn of him who said, quote, I am lowly. End quote. We have here a sad illustration of the proverb that, quote, pride goeth before a fall. End quote. Sooner or later, the spirit which I have been now exposing will bring punishment upon him who cherishes it, and the punishment will be of such a nature as to make the sinner see and know the heinousness of his sin. You cannot read this chapter without remembering that other record in the Acts of the Apostles. Quote, and upon a set day Herod, arrayed in royal apparel, sat upon his throne, and made an oration unto them. And the people gave a shout, saying, It is the voice of a God, and not of a man. And immediately the angel of the Lord smote him, because he gave not God the glory, and he was eaten of worms, and gave up the ghost. End quote. Which of us also has not recalled to his memory the parable of the rich fool, to whom, while he was in the act of congratulating himself on his prosperity, and planning barns and buildings new, it was said, quote, Thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. End quote. Ah, it is a fearful thing to make a god of one's self. Hath not Jehovah's prophet said, quote, The idols he shall utterly abolish? End quote. And if that idol in our case be self, think you self will not by him be degraded and destroyed? But not without warning do his strokes fall. Many years were given to the antediluvians before the flood came and submerged them, and 12 months of grace were given to Nebuchadnezzar here before the blow was struck which made his reason reel. So yet Jehovah warns those who are in the path of danger. And who can tell but the discourse of this evening may be by him designed to be to some proud and haughty sinner here what this dream and its interpretation were to Nebuchadnezzar? Oh, let the proud take warning and, quote, humble themselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt them in due time. End quote. In the third place, we have here a beautiful illustration of fidelity in the proclamation of God's truth. It cost Daniel a great deal to give this interpretation of the dream to the monarch. The king had been very kind to him, and he would rather have done a great many other things than have unfolded to him all that was declared by the vision. But there was no help for it. Necessity was laid upon him, and faithfulness alike to Jehovah and to Nebuchadnezzar required that he should speak the whole truth. Hence he gave the interpretation with the utmost exactness, and then in the most courteous manner he advised the king to repentance. Now, only they who have had to say unwelcome truths to those who are above them in station, or to whom in worldly matters they have been much beholden, can estimate the difficulty and delicacy of the position which the prophet occupied. Many in his place would have evaded the duty altogether and held their peace. Many others, perhaps, under the plea of being faithful, would have become impertinent and used language both uncourtly and unwarranted. But what could be finer than Daniel's bearing all through? With manifest sorrow the interpretation is given, and after that is finished, there is this brief and beautiful application made. Quote, Wherefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable unto thee, and break off thy sins by righteousness, and thine iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, if it may be a lengthening of thy tranquillity. End quote. What an example have we here to every messenger of God! Equally removed from time-serving timidity and impertinent rudeness, he sets the truth in loving faithfulness before his master, and behold his reward. Perhaps the king was annoyed in the first instance, but he lived to value the advice, and here 5 years, yea, perhaps 8 years, after it had been given, it is reproduced by the monarch himself, and inserted in his decree to show how much he came at length to value the friendship of his servant. May God help every preacher of his truth to be as faithful and as courteous as was Daniel here. In the fourth place, we have surely a loud call addressed to us in this chapter to thank God for the continuance of our reason. How seldom we think of this, yet how important it is after all. What a blessing it is to have a sound mind in a sound body. Let us praise God for its possession, and let us use means for its preservation. I do not think that we in this age are nearly so careful in this respect as we ought to be. We are living at high pressure. We are going, intellectually, at express speed, and so, not unfrequently, our finest minds are ruined, and our most useful men rendered mentally incapable of serving either their country or their age. Others there are who wilfully court insanity, and by excesses of sensuality and intemperance sow the seeds of disease in the brain, whereby, at length, their intellects are clouded and their end is darkened. Let us avoid all this. Let us show our gratitude to God for our reason, not only by the ascription of praise to him for its possession, but also by using it in his service, and by doing our best to preserve it for his glory. In the fifth place, we are here reminded that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men. God is the King of kings, and however men may plan and scheme, however they may make war and peace, whatsoever laws they may proclaim or treaties they may sign, quote, he doeth according to his will among the armies of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. End quote. How this can be, while yet men are free agents, uncoerced in any way, and following only the inclinations of their own hearts, we cannot tell, but so it is. Quote, there are many devices in a man's heart, nevertheless the counsel of the Lord, that shall stand. End quote. Herod schemes, and Pilate trims, according to the nature of each. Yet the result is the doing of what God's, quote, hand and counsel determined before to be done, end quote. And the same is true yet. Amidst wars and revolutions, amidst the schemings of emperors and chancellors, seeking only their own aggrandizement, God is ruling still, and he will bring out, clear and definite at last, before men's eyes, the much-forgotten truth that the allegiance of their hearts is due to him. This is our comfort amidst the movements of our times. No doubt, as men pursue their schemes and rage in their ambition, he may seem asleep, as Jesus was in the little boat upon the lake. But by and by he will awake and cry, quote, peace, be still, end quote. And in the calm thereby produced, the church will go forward on its glorious mission and gather in the saved into its bosom. There is one who can say, and who will say at the proper time, to Tsar and Sultan alike, quote, hitherto shall ye come, but no further, and here shall your proud waves be stayed. End quote. There is one of whom it is written, quote, he maketh the wrath of man to praise him, and restraineth the remainder thereof. End quote. If this be true, then how safe the counsel of the psalmist, himself a king, quote, be wise now, therefore, O ye kings, be instructed, ye judges of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and ye perish from the way, when his wrath is kindled but a little. Blessed are all they that put their trust in him. End quote. And for ourselves, why should we wait till a judgment teaches us this truth as it was taught to Nebuchadnezzar? Let us tonight submit ourselves to God through Jesus Christ, and yield to him the throne of our hearts and the homage of our lives.